welcome to the third episode of the Production Roundtable series. My name is Evan Clary, and I'm here today with special guests from JB Machinery, Spencer Bird, the Northeast Regional Sales Manager, and Dave Burgess, the Vice President of Sales and Marketing. Today, we're going to be discussing some questions about dryers. And the first question we have here to answer is how do infrared dryers work and how do they fit on the machine?
Okay, so Flexo inks typically dry through evaporation. What we're doing by employing infrared dryers is we're accelerating the removal of the moisture in the ink through the use of shortwave infrared energy. Shortwave infrared energy is much like your domestic light bulb. It's fast on, it's fast off, and it's got a very short focal point. And our job is simply to remove the moisture from the ink. There's a misconception out there that using infrared dryers, we're actually going to heat up the corrugated board itself. Now, when the board goes through the machine, you're barely going to notice the temperature difference in the board from the start to the finish. I'll say it again, we're targeting the moisture in the ink. We're not heating up the board. Now, interestingly, we get a lot of calls in the winter about drying problems. The vast majority of those are because the board that's been sitting in a warehouse or in the back of a trailer is cold. It's less than 70 degrees. So what we want is board that runs around 70 degrees or higher going into the machine, and that helps the whole process. So
it helps if people bring in the sheets and have them acclimate to room temperature before they run them through the machine.
Absolutely. We tell people wherever possible, bring them in and let them sit for 24 hours, and then we'll run them through the machine, and we see a distinct difference in the drying capabilities. So when you look at how a dryer operates, when we're running at let's just say 5,000 sheets an hour on a 66-inch cylinder, we've literally got 160 milliseconds of heat, of time to target and dry that sheet. So what we're doing is literally drying a sheet in the blink of an eye. So as far as the location, the dryers are located on the outbound side of the print station. So the dryers come into contact with the sheet immediately after the ink's been deposited on the sheet by the plate. The nice thing with infrared drying is that there's very little, if any, residual heat. So you don't get any ink drying on the plates, in the cells of the analogs, or anywhere else on the machine. Again, it's a very targeted, focused energy that we're using to dry the sheets. There's 4 types of dryers, 4 designs of dryers that we use. The largest dryer is what we call a final Flexo dryer, and that typically will be the final dryer right after the last print station, right before the die cut. We then have a series of interstation Flexo dryers, and it really depends on the geometry of the machine, the width of the side frame, and the space that we are given as to which dryer we're going to use in between each individual print station. On the latest high board line machines, we've got infinite space, so we can actually use a final Flexo dryer between each of the print sections, between each of the print downs. So that allows us to run at higher speeds because we've got more complete drying going on throughout the process.
Sure. Does it vary if you're trying to dry a real dark ink versus a lighter color ink, the model of the dryer that you would use?
Doesn't vary the model of the dryer, but certain inks will dry better than other inks. One of the inks that we've traditionally had issues with is reflex blue. There's some degree of reflectivity in the ink itself so we struggle. Sometimes we struggle. One of the later subjects we're going to talk about is analogs roll cell volume, and that's where that relationship is really, really important. as far as the amount of ink that's sitting on the sheet. And obviously the type of paper being used is also a big factor. If we're using kraft or white top, you've got a little evaporation, you've got some of the ink that's actually soaking into the sheet, and then with the IR we're able to remove the rest of it. If you're dealing with a semi-coated or a coated sheet, then there is no soaking of that ink into the sheet, so we have to remove every bit of moisture to leave that homogeneous ink layer.
Is there any adjustment of temperature for the different type of sheets that you might run?
There is. The JB dryers are designed so that we have basically infinite control on the temperature. We can vary the temperature between 1 and 100% in increments of 1%. So on a kraft sheet, you may only need 60% in order to dry the sheet. We don't want to run 100% because at that point we're wasting energy. Some of that is touch and feel. Some of that will be determined by the job itself. One of the things that we're working on as an organization is to come up with a recipe, because obviously we're leaving so much of that in the operator's hands. We'd want to come up with a recipe where we can basically predict the dryer temperatures that are required based on the substrate we're running and the ink cell volume.
Sure.
So that's in the works, that's in the planning stages, and what we like is for the operator to simply put in a recipe, and we then predict how much heat is going to be required throughout the print stations.
Sure. Anytime you can get rid of the operator black magic, it's always a good thing, because there's a lot of inconsistency a lot of times between operators and how they run the machine.
Absolutely, and there's a vast difference in operator skills, in operator experience. There's a vast difference between day shift and night shift. So the goal of JB is wherever possible to take the operator out of the equation.
Definitely, that makes sense. The next question: how can dryers assist in the production of high quality direct flexo printing?
When it comes to high quality direct flexo printing, there are 2 to 3 major ways in which incorporating dryers can help to achieve this. The first way is in which we are able to keep the lamina layer of ink on the surface of the sheet rather than have it bleed into the actual paper fibers. So when you incorporate the dryer into the printing process, instead of the ink being kind of printed on the substrate and then due to the water within the ink, the aqueous element of the ink, it will tend to sink into the paper fibers, causing more of a dull and less glossy finish. With incorporating dryers, now as Dave mentioned, you're drying in a blink of an eye. So you have 180 milliseconds in which we're drying to complete in the complete fashion in order to keep that layer of ink that I mentioned before that would normally sink into the paper fibers if it wasn't dry. Now it's staying on the surface, and you're creating that element of vibrancy, of gloss in the color, just creating more of that pop factor, attracting the consumers over to now that display or that retail ready packaging, etc. As far as the second way in which we can increase the production of high quality direct flexo printing, we are increasing the ink on press stability. And what I mean by that is that when you incorporate a dryer, we ask that the converter does not use fast drying agents within the ink. We find that a lot of the time the converters we work with are using fast drying agents. And what we try to advise against that is because when you introduce our infrared light, high-speed infrared light, in which you're drying very quickly, and then you have the presence of fast drying agents, you run the risk of potentially drying ink out on the plate, as well as potentially plugging your analox roll as well. So we heavily advise against that if you do have IR dryers on the machine, and we think that by incorporating them, there is no need for the fast drying agents and the additives within the ink that you're bringing to press. The final way in which we can really increase overall quality of Flexo printing with the incorporation of a dryer is we give you the ability now to dry trap color on color. So we are able to fully dry one color before printing on the next. With that being said, you eliminate the potential for ghosting. You eliminate the potential for strike through while wet trapping from color to color. And now you can print your PMS, your process, or your spot colors sequentially without having to worry about wet trapping. You can now dry trap to completion, and the finished product looks very presentable. All while these three major benefits, when incorporating a dryer, now it results in less sheet waste and less ink waste, because if you drag ink off the anvil onto the finished sheet, and or if you're wet trapping and there's strike through and it's not acceptable for a customer, as far as a customer reject from the converter side, now you're mitigating and you're reducing the amount of waste amongst the ink and the sheets that are going through press as well.
Sure. Talk to me about the fast drying agents in the ink. Do you think there's any chance that a converter has those in their ink and they don't know? Or is it something that they pay extra for to have?
Usually the converter opts in for that. In some cases, ink manufacturers will advise for it. But we always stand by, hey, if you have dryers on the machine, that is your fast drying agent in a sense. And we want to definitely kind of mitigate the risk of, as I mentioned before, ruining plates or plugging your analox roll, because now you have heat and fast drying agents in the same process. So it becomes somewhat of an issue at some point.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Yeah, Evan, if I could just chip in there for a second. I think, when we go and put dryers on a machine in a converter, then we're telling the ink company to really simplify the formulation, the ink formulation. We're removing all of the complications of fast drying agents, and we want simply a liquid ink that we can drive away the moisture. That's basically all we're asking for. And fast drying agents have been very common, particularly for those accounts that haven't had dryers. It's the only way they've been able to print color on color. But the dryers remove that altogether. And quite frankly, the ink companies tend to really enjoy a converter switching to a infrared dryer, because it simplifies their formulations.
Sure. It's one less variable that they have to deal with.
Yeah.
What other benefits do infrared dryers provide on an inline die cutter or Flexo?
There are a couple additional benefits. The bigger one that a lot of our customers really enjoy and benefit from is the speed potential increases, mostly on rotary die cutters. When it comes to Flexo folder gluers, same way, in the sense of both rotaries and Flexos, with the addition of one final Flexo dryer. In most cases, we're able to increase print speeds by 50% or more, depending on specified analox volumes and different substrates run. As you would probably guess, when you are running a modeled or a craft substrate, there's less holdout. So with that being said, there's less need for drying as far as that. But if you were to incorporate dryers into that process on those substrates with a little less holdout, it would only increase those speeds. And as kind of the markets are developing within the graphics side and people putting more block print and type and line work down, people are seeing these production speeds, these increase as a major benefit within that inline rotary die cutting or flexo folding gluing process. The second major benefit would be you're eliminating the ink smearing and the ghosting that I mentioned previously, as well as we find that there's a lot of ink buildup on folding rails and die anvils from wet ink being dragged off. With the incorporation of using a dryer, you're able to mitigate and eliminate that risk altogether because as we previously mentioned, we are drying in a flash of an eye, almost 180 milliseconds. So each succeeding down with a dryer is fully dry before printing on the next. So those would be the two main benefits when printing inline.
Yeah, speed is definitely important. Everybody's shifting now towards the high speed, quick setup machines. And then with that, minimizing downtime to clean the dried ink on the folding rails or the anvil. That's very important too. How important are the analog scroll volumes when adding dryers to a machine?
Analog cell volume is absolutely critical. Whenever we're doing a new machine installation or a conversion of a machine to infrared dryers, then we always involve the analog scroll manufacturer. As we've already said 2 or 3 times, we're drying in the blink of an eye. So it's a very simple formula. The more ink that's sitting on the sheet, the harder it is to dry. So what we really want to establish is what's the least amount of ink that we can sit on that sheet and still carry that heavy solid or that line work, etc., without having excess ink that we've got to drive the moisture away from to leave us that single layer of ink. And basically what it comes down to is speed. If we have the right analog volume, then we can run. We have full dryers throughout the machine. We can run the machine at its rated machine speed. If we have more ink than we feel is necessary, then we've got to slow the machine down to allow the sheet more dwell time over the dryer so that we can remove the moisture. We actually have a document that we call the fine printing guidelines, and in that we state that for semi-coated or coated sheets, we'd like to see cell volumes at 5.5 BCMs or less. That's our target. And basically that's a target that we've developed over the years after seeing a lot of installations and seeing what works and what doesn't work. So as long as we have 5.5 or less, we can basically guarantee that your machine is going to run at its rated speed. If, for example, that a customer feels he's trying to run multiple papers on the same machine, so he needs an 8.5 or a 7.5 BCM to put a solid on craft, then when we get that 8.5 or 7.5 to a coated sheet, we're really going to have to slow the machine down to get it dried before it gets to the die cut. But we always want to involve the analogs people in the decisions, and also the ink. We always recommend a supplier meeting where we sit around a table and look at actual print jobs, print cards, and determine cell volumes throughout the machine.
Makes a lot of sense. Can you put dryers on a top print machine? And if you do, how does it differ from a bottom print machine?
Yeah, so yes, in the past we've worked with OEMs to put dryers on mostly top print flexo folder gluers, and up until recently, many converters have not found the need for dryers as they are not putting much ink down on, for example, a food shipper where you just have a little line work and a cert stamp. But as we've noticed recently, with the rise of retail ready packaging as well as e-commerce, we've now noticed those same converters who were doing that type of basic work now move into more of the complex work where they're putting block print down with some line or type work, and then also potentially varnishing in some cases. So by incorporating a dryer on a top print machine, you're essentially going to have that initial speed benefit that I mentioned before, where you can run at the manufacturer's rated speed, as well as you're eliminating the potential for marking through the transfer sections and the folding rails, as now the wet ink is now, pointed up to the transfer section. So we found that a lot of these Flexo folder gluer users are saying, hey, as we put more solids down, we're finding that we're scuffing through the machine, we're ruining the print, we're wasting sheets, we're wasting ink. So they're now incorporating a dryer to make that a lot easier for them, run at speed, less waste, and they're able to achieve the graphics that they want while getting that kind of vibrance and that pop that I mentioned before, from kind of keeping the print on the surface of the sheet rather than let it sink into the paper fibers.
Yeah, it's funny. You still see a lot of brown box, color jobs, but on Flexo specifically, in the past couple of years, I've seen a lot of high quality print jobs. It seems people are doing a lot more fine print and high quality printing on Flexos, and I think a lot of that probably has to do with the use of dryers.
Absolutely.
Why are the dryers so important for inside out printing, which has become so popular in the past couple of years?
Yeah, by nature, you're printing on the inside and the outside of the box and die cutting in line. And because of that, you're creating stresses. You're pulling the sheet from either a bottom print to a top print, or from a top print to a bottom print. You're going through a transition area, and one way or the other, the printed sheet is going to come into contact either with the wheels of the vacuum transfer, the belts of the vacuum transfer, and quite frankly, if the sheets aren't dry on both sides, you're going to get transfer of the ink and smearing of the ink in the vacuum transfer sections. And then, just like we've already said, if it's not dry going through the die cut station, then you're going to be building up ink on the die blanket, and you're going to have some residual smearing. This is a market that really has exploded over the last 12 or 18 months for us. And what we're telling customers is that at a minimum, they should have one dryer after the top print section, and they may have 1, 2, or 3 top print sections, but at a minimum have one dryer after the top print section before it makes the transfer to the bottom print, and then again one dryer before it gets to the bottom print, after the bottom print section, before it gets to the die cut. Doing that way, we're not able to trap colors, we're not able to dry trap, as Spencer was talking about earlier, but we are able to guarantee that the colors you're putting down are going to be fixed in place as they go through the process, and they're not going to be distorted by the die cut, and they're not going to be rubbing off on the belts or the wheels of the vacuum transfer.
Yeah, see, I know exactly what you're talking about with the ink getting on the vacuum transfer wheels or belts and building up. Certainly not a good thing long term, and then it can lead to smearing and then uneven surfaces on the vacuum transfer wheels. It's definitely a big problem. And changing out the vacuum transfer wheels, if you have to, on a lot of machines can be a big issue because you have to take out the entire shaft.
Yeah.
Not a super easy process.
Yeah, and we're seeing these machines in a multitude of configurations. We're seeing 1 top, 2 bottom. We're seeing 1 top, 5 bottom. We have a machine out there that's three top printers and then 4 bottom. And the customer is actually applying a UV coating on the inside of the box. So we're seeing a whole variety of applications here. And I think what's fascinating is that when we talk to customers about inside out printing, they're all doing it, but they're all doing it right now in 2 passes, and they're having to flip the sheet. So by going to an inline machine like this, they're making some huge time savings that obviously is going to pay dividends for them.
Yeah, huge time savings. They're eliminating waste by not having to run the sheet through twice, because anytime you run the sheet through twice, you run into instances where you get damaged, all kinds of stuff. The print might not be right. So it's very interesting. What do you guys think about the future for inside out printing? Do you think we're going to see it continue to grow in our industry?
Very definitely. And obviously, e-commerce is a huge driver. The unboxing experience has become a big thing. If you go to YouTube, you can search for unboxing, and there's all sorts of videos on there of people opening the box. But I think the die cutter particularly, and to some extent Flexos, the die cutter of the future will almost always have at least one top print station. It gives the manufacturer the ability to just put a www, a brand, a logo, something simple that goes on the inside of the box for identification. So we're certainly seeing a lot of the independents when they're looking at a die cutter now. Usually, the option that they're looking at is at least one top print station.
Yeah, it's pretty neat because I've seen some pretty creative stuff that people have done with inside out printing as far as, like you said, you could print a logo, just a website inside, but I've even seen some instructions printed on the inside of the box for how to assemble the product or things like that.
Yeah.
It adds a lot of versatility for the converter to be able to provide that in a single pass. Well, that wraps up our questions for today, but I wanted to thank you guys for joining me on the show.
Thank you, Evan. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Appreciate the time.
Yeah, thanks for having Evan. Thanks for having us, Evan, and let us know if there's any other questions that we can answer if they come up.
I will, and I'm going to post the contact information for you guys at the end of the video.